Can you eat rice, bread, and potatoes without spiking your blood sugar? Well, there is some truth to it, but using that as a reason to eat more bread and potatoes is wrong on so many levels. The real story is completely different than what you have probably heard, and if done right though, the benefits can actually be tremendous. Hello, health champions. Today we're going to talk about resistant starch and what it really is, what it really does, and the real reason you probably want to get some. So let's talk about different kinds of starch first. So regular starch is something that we eat. We have amylase, which is an enzyme that breaks it down into glucose. And starch is basically 100% glucose once we break it down. That's why bread and flour and potatoes, when we cook them normally, they cause significant blood sugar spikes. On the other end of the spectrum is fiber, which our human enzymes can't touch it at all. And it does different things we're going to talk about, but it basically passes through. It does not raise blood sugar at all. And then we have resistant starch, which is kind of in between because amylase technically could break it down, but because of the crystalline structure, amylase can't reach it. But the configuration of the molecule, technically, we should be able to break it down, but because of the structure, we don't. And therefore, amylase can't reach it. There are no blood sugar spikes because it travels intact all the way down into the colon. And we can't absorb it in the small intestine, which is where we absorb glucose and which causes blood sugar spikes. So there's 4 different classifications of resistant starch, but we're going to talk about the 2 that matter the most to us, and that's RS2, which is naturally occurring crystalline starch that we find in raw potatoes, raw oats, and in green bananas. And then RS3 is where we cook something. We cook the rice, we cook the potatoes, and now we take that percentage of crystalline structure starch and we destroy the RS. We turn it into a digestive starch. But once we cool it, a portion of that reverts back into crystalline. So there's more resistant starch than there was, and therefore it doesn't spike blood sugar as much. But we really need to understand this, and that's why we're going over this, because it's so misunderstood and people do themselves a lot of damage. But why do we care about resistant starch at all? Because it arrives intact to the colon, to the distant portion of our digestive tract, and there we have bacteria that ferment it into short-chain fatty acids. And there's different kinds. So resistant starch becomes butyrate, propionate, and acetate. And fiber, interestingly, also become the same 3 components, but if you look closely, with resistant starch, we get mostly butyrate, and with fiber, we get mostly propionate and acetate. And why does that matter? They're all 3 very good. They support bacteria, they support structure, but the butyrate is the main fuel for the cells in our colon, in our entire digestive tract. So the lining of our digestive tract, they're called enterocytes, and in the colon, they're called colonocytes. And if we starve them, they're going to be very, very unhealthy, and we're going to get leaky gut and all sorts of problems. But if we feed them properly, if we give them an abundance of butyrate, now we get healthier colonocytes, and some of those cells are called goblet cells. Those are the ones that secrete mucus, mucin, that forms that protective layer on the inside of the gut. And that is tremendously important because with increased mucus, with proper mucus production or mucin, now we get a healthier environment overall, and we get tighter junctions between the cells, and we get a thicker protective layer, and as a result, we have less leaky gut, and we can even use this to reverse leaky gut, which is responsible for huge health problems what we see today, like inflammatory bowel disease and autoimmunity inflammation, IBS, and so on. And while we can make butyrate a few different ways, we have to keep in mind the reason we're talking about this in the video is that resistant starch is the best fuel for butyrate-producing bacteria. So just like fiber, it goes through the digestive tract untouched, but it does different things. So we have soluble fiber that dissolves in water. It forms a gel and it slows gastric emptying, which is good because it dulls the blood sugar spikes and it allows us time to absorb nutrients. Then we have insoluble fiber, which is basically bulk. It increases bulk, and if there's more bulk, now we're going to make sure that it keeps moving along. The peristalsis works better. And resistant starch, like we already said, it selectively feeds these butyrate-producing bacteria, and it ferments very slowly. It's a slow fuel compared to glucose and fiber, and it makes it all the way to the end of the digestive tract. So because of that, there is much fewer problems with gas and bloating than people who take other forms of fiber or other things that they use to try to help the gut, like inulin or fructooligosaccharides. And the reason this is so incredibly important is that it becomes the premier fuel. The butyrate is the premier fuel for two of the keystone species. And a keystone species, that's a type of bacteria that becomes kind of a pillar, a foundation, something that provides stability in that ecosystem down there. And two of the most important ones are Faecalibacterium prosnitzii, and don't worry about the fancy names here. Another one's called Roseburia intestinalis. And if we feed those properly, they make a ton of mucus. Now, indirectly, they're going to they're going to create conditions for a third kind that doesn't feed off butyrate. It eats the mucin, the mucus. So we feed these two first and they make the mucus. And then we have a third one that eats the mucus. So how does that work? Well, the first two create the protective layer and healthy intestinal cells. And why do we care about the third one if all it does is it eats mucus? Because people with insulin resistance and obesity and metabolic problems are almost always low in akkermansia. So there's metabolic signaling involved. And that's why an important balance in your biome is so important. Another interesting thing that happens is that once you feed this akkermansia, once it starts eating a bunch of mucus, it actually stimulates these goblet cells that I mentioned to make more and healthier mucus, so the quality of it actually improves. Now here's an interesting mechanism that very few people talk about. It's called the second meal effect. So after you eat resistant starch, it has an impact on blood sugar responses for the next meal. So we talked about how we make three different kinds of short-chain fatty acids. We make mostly butyrate, but also we make propionate. And propionate tells the liver to reduce gluconeogenesis. So very often in people with insulin resistance, they have an excessive gluconeogenesis. Their liver makes too much glucose. So here we have a propionate that tells it to slow that down. And in research, they have found that in healthy people, metabolically healthy people, you can get a drop in 10 to 20 milligrams per deciliter of your glucose response on the next meal. So you eat many hours later, even breakfast the next morning, and your glucose spike is 10 to 20 points lower than it would be otherwise. And in people with insulin resistance, the effect is even greater, but it's not as consistent. It's more erratic. Another thing that propionate does, it also triggers GLP-1, which there's a lot of talk about now. They give people medications with GLP-1 in it. Well, here's a natural version that is much weaker, but because it's natural, it's not going to have the side effect. It's part of how the body regulates this. Now, the GLP-1 is going to slow gastric emptying. Again, we talked about how that's a good thing. it will tell the liver to make less glucagon, or actually the pancreas to make less glucagon, and the glucagon leads to less gluconeogenesis by the liver and therefore less blood glucose spikes and less insulin. And GLP-1 also reduces hunger. So the medication GLP-1 does all of this, but it does it very harshly, and it sort of interferes with the body's regulatory mechanisms in doing this, and that's why you can have severe side effects long term. Now you're not getting the medication, but you're getting a mild, natural version of the same mechanism. And there's actually a good bit of solid research on resistant starch. And what they have found is there's two different types of benefits. One has to do with metabolic improvement, and the other is for bacterial balance improvement and gut health. So already with as little as 3.5 grams per day, which could be about a teaspoon of potato starch, for 4 weeks, they could already measure significant improvements, increases in Faecalibacterium and in this Akkermansia. And again, the butyrate from resistant starch doesn't feed the Akkermansia, but the Akkermansia feeds off the mucus resulting from the other two. And here's the really cool part. In just 4 weeks, with just a teaspoon, they noticed significant reduction in both diarrhea and constipation. So it's not like a medication that tries to go in and block a certain mechanism. This is something that normalizes the environment down there so it works the way it's supposed to. And if you take a little bit more, such as 20 to 30 or 20 plus grams per day, and you take it a little bit longer, like 8 to 12 weeks or longer, there's nothing that says you can't, now you start getting metabolic benefits. And what they noticed was consistent drops in blood glucose, drops in insulin, and in HOMA-IR, which is just a formula to measure. It's homeostatic model assessment of insulin resistance. So it is a much stronger way of measuring insulin resistance than just blood glucose, but it did lower all of these. And they also found significant reductions in leaky gut. And here's an interesting one. They found a reduction in histamine levels. So histamine is something that is released in response to allergies and hypersensitivity reactions. And a lot of people who have inflammatory bowel disease, people who have skin problems and rashes and brain fog, they're actually suffering from histamine sensitivities. Both their body might make too much, but they also react to histamine in food because we can get it many different ways. But if you can normalize that gut environment, now they observed that the histamine levels could actually lower. And in most of these research studies, people were consuming raw potato starch. And it's raw because as soon as you cook it, as soon as you use it to thicken a sauce or something, now you're destroying that RS2 structure. And now we're getting to the critical portion here, because almost everywhere I look, people don't understand this. They think that, hey, if that has a little bit of resistant starch, now I can eat as many carbs as I want. That is not how it works. It's not a free pass to start eating pasta and all forms of comfort foods. The benefits come from adding the resistant starch, this type of molecule that can feed the bacteria. It does not come from adding in more bread, more rice, and potatoes in your diet. And yet, that is how I've seen most of the titles and most of the videos promote this, unfortunately, and people get very, very confused and misled. And here's the key to understand that people don't get. They think that if you cook 100 grams of rice and then cool it down, now it all turns into resistant starch. That's not how it works. 100 grams of cold rice is not 100 grams of resistant starch. We're going to look at the numbers in just a second. Only a fraction of the starch, the carbohydrates, actually revert and turn back into resistant starch. And here's how we want to look at these numbers and understand this. So I've talked before about if you want to go low carb, if you want to do a ketogenic diet. Now, carbs are the things that we can break down and they turn into glucose and they raise blood sugar. But we can subtract the fiber because we can't break down the fiber. We can't digest it. So there's no way for that to turn into blood glucose. So therefore, carbs minus fiber is net carbs. And net carbs are the portion that raise blood sugar. This is how we typically think about it. But now, if we eat things with resistant starch and it has significant amounts, we have to start including that in the calculation because resistant starch does not raise blood sugar. We can't break it down. It does not become blood glucose. So now what we really want to look at is the net carbs minus the resistant starch. And for some foods, it makes very little difference. But for the ones we're going to look at, it makes all the difference. And now that portion that we can actually still break down, that still metabolize and become blood glucose, we call them metabolic carbs, metabolizable or metabolic carbs, MC. So to really drive home visually what we're talking about, I created this graphic here. So we're going to look at white rice in different forms. We're going to look at overnight oats, which is where you drop raw oats into cold water overnight, and then in the morning you eat it or drink it or mix it in a smoothie or something. We're going to look at hot potato and cold potato, which you could make a potato salad, for example. We're going to look at lentils, and here you could eat them hot or cold, because this is one case where you have a different form of resistant starch. This is where the resistant starch is kind of tied into the cellular structure of the legume, and therefore it doesn't matter which way you go. We're going to look at green banana when you eat it raw and green banana flour, and then finally the raw potato starch that they use in all the research. So we talked about resistant starch. We're going to look at that. We're going to talk about the fiber. And once you subtract the fiber and the resistant starch from the carb count, we get metabolic carbs. And just for ease of comparison, we're going to take all of the water out of these foods because white rice has a lot of water in it, whereas powder has virtually none. So just to compare more evenly, we're going to take out all the water and just look at the percentage of resistant starch in the carbohydrate portion. So here is how much carb is in the food, how much carbohydrate. And with cooked rice, it's about that much. It's like 3% of the cooked rice has that much resistant starch. It has about 1% fiber. That's that little gray, which is so tiny you can barely see it in white rice. And 96% of cooked rice is still metabolic carbs. That's the starch portion. It turns into glucose and very quickly becomes blood glucose. Now, if we cool it, it does help. It doubles. It goes from 3% up to 6%. And this, again, is not 6% of the rice. It's 6% of the carb portion. So that means in cooked rice, we get about 1.5 grams per 100 grams of cooked rice. And for cold rice, it's about twice as much. Now, a little bit of fiber, and then we still have 93% of metabolic carbs in cold rice. So this is where I'm saying it's not okay to eat cold rice. If you think that you're just getting resistant starch, you're getting mostly starch that raises blood sugar. Now, overnight oats is a little bit better. We get more than twice as much resistant starch. We get more fiber, but still 70% of this turns into blood glucose. So these are not the ways that you want to get it. Potato, for comparison, it's a little bit less than oats, but it's much more than rice and also more fiber. But we have 78% of the cooked potato is metabolic starch. And here's where it starts getting interested. Now we cool it and we turn it into a potato salad. This is the first time that we're getting significant amounts. We're getting 36% of the starch in that potato salad is actually resistant starch, and only 50% is something that we can turn into glucose. So again, if you're insulin resistant, this is not something that you want to have all the time, but you can include it, and we're going to look at some examples here, whereas rice is probably not something you want to touch. Lentils have 20% resistant starch, not a tremendous amount. Most of it is fiber, and that's why the metabolic portion is only 40%. Now, bananas, raw green bananas. Here, we often hear a lot of different numbers on how much starch, resistant starch, is actually in there. So we often hear like 39%, which would be like 10 grams maybe of resistant starch in a green banana. But here's how we need to think about it. If you eat something when it's completely, totally green, it's like you could hurt somebody with it, you could use it as a tool. Now it has 17 grams, about 90% of it is resistant starch. But this is completely inedible. You probably couldn't even get one bite down. It would be gritty and tart and horrendous. Now, by the time you could first eat it at all, it's not going to be pleasant. It's going to have about 10 grams. And when it's like equal between yellow and green, now it probably has about 6. And this is probably where people talk about green bananas, because it's still not as sweet as you would think of it or what most people would like. But now you're getting a fair amount. However, by the time it's ripe and yellow, not even with the brown spots, now it's down to 1 gram. So that resistant starch quickly breaks down into sugar. So now we're getting to the superstars of this chart. And green banana flour has 62% of the weight is resistant starch, but still 28% metabolic carbs. And the reason they use potato starch in all the research is very plain when you see this. 95% of it is resistant starch, and only about 4 or 5% is actually metabolic carbs. So that's why when you mix potato starch in cold water and drink it, or in a smoothie, almost all of it, almost 100% of the weight becomes the stuff that you're actually looking for. And I really also want to emphasize the other side of the coin with these foods like cold rice that we hear so often about as being great. When you eat hot white rice, you're getting 45 times more metabolic carbs than resistant starch. So you're getting 45 times more of the stuff you don't want along with the thing you do want. With cooled rice, it drops to 15 times, which is still a huge number. And with overnight oats, it's still 6 times. Whereas with some of the ones we looked on the previous page, it's the inverse of these ratios. And why does that matter? Because if you have SIBO, which is small intestine bacterial overgrowth, which is rampant, or if you have some bacterial imbalance in your colon, in your large intestine called dysbiosis, now what happens is these metabolic carbs, they break down to glucose. Virtually 100% of those metabolic carbs is glucose. And they feed absolutely everything, not just the good bacteria, but the bad as well. And it feeds these fast fermenting bacteria, a lot of which are the pathogens, the ones that you don't want. So it's just like eating sugar. This starch that breaks into glucose feeds the stuff that you don't want. So the fact that you're getting a little bit of beneficial stuff is really not a big deal. You're getting mostly bad things. And when people hear that they can eat this freely if they cool it, now what actually happens is you may worsen your dysbiosis, your imbalance, and you may actually overfeed the pathogens. So how can you make sure that you get enough of this resistant starch? If you're looking for these benefits for your bacterial flora and for your metabolic health, we're going to look at 2 scenarios. And the first is if you're insulin sensitive, if you can tolerate carbohydrate, if you can tolerate metabolic carbs, meaning you have metabolic flexibility. You can break them down, process them to your system. Now, let's say that you're looking for 15 to 20 grams per day for gut health, or a little bit more, maybe like 20 to 30 if you want to reduce insulin resistance, which again, we're already sort of assuming that you are fairly insulin sensitive. But if you eat some of these cold overnight oats, like we talked about, like half a cup of oats is 40 grams in cold water, you're getting 3 to 3.5 grams. If you eat some cold potato salad, 100 grams of that would be probably 5 grams of resistant starch. If you eat cooked lentils, half a cup, you're getting about 4 grams. You add in some green banana. One banana would be about 100 grams. You could get 7, but remember that graphic I showed you, that if it turns yellow, you're getting a fraction of that. So 7 is still not really what you think of as a tasty banana. And if you eat some cold rice from the day before, 100 grams of that will get you about 1.7 grams. So these are just examples. And if you add this all up, you get a total of 20 grams of resistant starch. They got lots of stuff to make butyrate and feed your gut bacteria. And with that, you're getting 55 grams of metabolic carbs. And to that, just as an example, I'm assuming that you're still eating some leafy greens and some non-starchy vegetables just to kind of fill out your diet and get some variety. And now that would probably add about 30 grams of net carbs. You're at a total of 85, which is okay for someone who is active and metabolically healthy, insulin sensitive. But if you're insulin resistant, we'll look at that in a second, then this is probably not the way to go. Now, for the insulin resistant, the options are more limited. And I want you to think of this as if you have measured insulin resistant, if your fasting insulin is high, if your HOMA-IR is high, you are carbohydrate intolerant. Your system no longer knows how to process those properly. When you eat these metabolic carbs, your blood sugar jumps, your insulin jumps, and they stay high for long periods of time because your body does not know how to process it. So because of that, you probably want to go a little bit higher in your goals of resistant starch. So probably 20 to 30 grams per day. And the only options I would suggest is raw potato starch and green banana flour. If you take 2 tablespoons of each, 20 grams or so, you're getting 19 grams from the potato and 12 grams from the banana flour. And I probably recommend, especially in the beginning, that because you have different size spoons and scoops and the powder can compact, you probably want to weigh it for accuracy and consistency, at least until you kind of get the hang of it. And you can put this very, very easily. It's not a lot of powder. You can put this very easily in a smoothie or just mix it in with cold water. And now when we add this up, you're getting 31 grams of resistant starch that's going to feed these butyrate-producing bacteria. They're going to help to strengthen your gut lining, strengthen the bacterial populations, and they will improve your metabolic signaling. And you're only getting 3 grams of these metabolic carbs that we talked about. And assuming that you're still eating a variety of foods, like we talked about on the previous slide, you're getting 30 grams of net carbs from leafy greens and non-starchy vegetables. So now at 33 grams, you're still in a very low carb level, in basically a ketogenic diet for most people. You don't truly know unless you measure it, but for most people, that's still a ketogenic diet. And occasionally, you could even have some of this potato salad. It's like for a treat, you could have some roast beef with potato salad or maybe a green salad as well on the side. And this would give you 5 grams of resistant starch and add 7 grams of metabolic carbs. So it's not something that's going to blow you totally out of the water. It's nothing like cooked, cooled rice, for example. And I want to mention again just how this works, that resistant starch does not get absorbed. It cannot raise blood sugar. The resistant portion does not raise blood sugar. It does, however, provide some calories, but not for you, not directly. Because once you break it down into short-chain fatty acids, these are basically what it sounds like. They're fat. They're very short pieces of fat that feed the bacteria and the cells in your gut. And they provide about 2 calories per gram, so it's half as much as the carbs were, but don't fret over that. It's not a bad thing. We need energy. Your bugs need energy. The key is to not spike blood sugar with it. So I want you to think of resistant starch as a targeted tool that if you do it right with a solid understanding, it can bring tremendous health benefits for pennies a day. It's really like a no-brainer. Try it. It's not going to hurt you. However, if you do it wrong, and the way so many people promote it and present it as a way to just bring rice and bread and carbs back in your life and comfort foods, now you've turned it into a serious health trap. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love that one. And if you truly want to master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.